That brings us then to industrial populations. This domestic public dichotomy influences gender stratification in industrial societies, or that has influenced gender stratification. Um, we are rapidly changing gender roles. This traditional idea that a woman's place is in the home only spread after about the year 1900. Prior to that, the 1890s, in early industrial England, France, Germany, women filled a lot of factory positions. Women and children actually were preferred for much of the factory work, particularly because they had small stature and smaller hands. And so they were able to get into, they had better fine motor control. They were able to get into pieces of equipment that had jammed and work out those jams, sometimes losing their life in the process. Um, and this really persisted. I mean, child labor persisted until kind of mandated public schooling emerged. After about 1900, in the US, European immigrants moved into these factory jobs that were traditionally held by women. And so we see the emergence of a male biased labor force that was coupled with cultural notions that women were unfit for factory work because they were weak, because they were emotional, etc. This faded during the World Wars, and during both World War One and World War Two, we saw women filling these roles as, Rosie the Riveter here, filling much of the need for this hard physical labor of factory work when those men were then abroad. We've had really big changes that have occurred since about the 1970s. And so Maxine Margulis said that gendered work attitudes and beliefs have varied in response to American economic needs. In the 1890s, of course, women were workers. They worked in factories, they worked in fields, they labored on farms. From 1900 to about 1950, 1960, we had this notion that work was for men and home life was for women, and that women shouldn't be engaged in work outside the home. There were changes in the economy in the late 1960s, early 1970s that dramatically changed this to the point that it was necessary for women to work outside the home. Women started attending higher levels of schooling. Women started to fill positions that had traditionally been filled by men. And so between 1970 and 2014, the female percentage of the American workforce rose from 38% to 47%. We are now in 2018 at a point where about 56% of the workforce is women. Only about 44% of the workforce is men. So we have seen a phenomenal shift. In the 1970s, the roles that women were filling in work were things like secretary, school teacher, nurse, etc. We're still trying to shake free of some of this notion that women are only suited to work in certain fields. We've still got a long way to go. However, we do see women in positions of power. We see females as CEOs. We see women as surgeons, as lawyers, etc. But the one place where we're really lagging behind, and this midterm election helped to remedy this some. I mean, basically half the population is women. When you look at the composition of our government, much less than half of that is women or people of color. So, we still have huge strides to make before we see total equality, before we even have proportional representation in places like Congress and such. But we are making strides. So, as women have increasingly worked outside the home, this idea of gender roles of males and females has changed. One thing that we have seen in a modern context is an increasing feminization of poverty. What do we mean by this? Well, uh, generally now, when we see families that are living at or below the poverty line, they are oftentimes single parent, female headed households. In the United States, women and their children are increasingly represented among America's poorest people. This number of single parent, female headed households has more than doubled since 1959. Married couples are much more financially secure than single parents. The national average wage for single mothers is about $33,000. For married couples, it's $73,000. This trend is true worldwide. In Japan, about 10% of households are Single parent, female headed households. In South and Southeast Asia, 20%. In certain areas of Africa and the Caribbean, 50% of households are single parent, female headed households. So globally, these households that are headed by women are poorer than those that are headed by men. We still have wage inequity even in the United States, and it's not just because women fill roles that pay less. It is also within fields. If you survey even the salaries earned by people at UNM, we find that women are paid less than men for comparable work. It's not much less, but that salary inequity is still there. One way to improve the situation of poor women is to encourage them to organize through unions, through collaborative kind of networks, etc. All right, so where does that bring us? Well, now we've got to talk about what we really mean by gender, and particularly when people don't fill stereotypical gender norms. So, this is just a wide spectrum of gender expression. We can see what we typify as masculine and feminine, um, but you know, most people don't live by what Americans might typify as masculine and feminine. So, top left picture is the Wodabi. They are pastoralists in Niger, and they have male beauty pageants. They come together every year for the Yaki dance, which is where males put on makeup and dresses and fancy hats, and they dance in front of the women, and the women choose who they might travel off with after the Yaki dance is over. They exchange husbands there. In the middle, we've got an Amazonian woman who is demonstrating body modification. Top right, we've got a Hijra, which is a recognized third gender in India. These are often natal males who work in female roles. They are often serve roles as prostitutes. They also serve ceremonial roles as dancers for certain rituals and ceremonies. The middle row on the left, we've got an Amazonian group in Brazil who, for women, female rites of passage in puberty, they do feats of strength. So, kind of like our strongman competitions, but this is engaged in by women. That middle picture is perhaps the stereotypical what has in a not very politically correct role, been billed as a tranny or a transvestite in the United States. This is a picture taken from the early 1990s. Middle row on the right, we've got men in kilts, right? Skirts didn't used to be female attire. They used to be worn by men. Dresses used to be worn by men. The bottom left, we've got the man in Oregon who gave birth to his and his wife's baby. Um, he was transgendered, or he is a transgender female to male. So, born a natal female, never had a total hysterectomy, started taking cross sex hormones, had a mastectomy. Because of the cross sex hormones, developed more of a male body build and facial hair. But when his wife could not get pregnant with the sperm donor or with donor sperm, um, he went off of his cross-sex hormones and was able to conceive using a sperm donor and was able to carry that baby to term. The second picture on the bottom, we've got Barbie, who is perhaps considered a female ideal, though less and less so in modern times. We've got next to Barbie, we've got Chaz Bono, born Chastity Bono, the child of Sonny and Cher, who was raised as a natal female but chose to transition to male later in life. And then on the far right, we've got Ken, who's really not our stereotypical macho man. My brother always made fun of Ken and made my Barbies pair bond with G.I. Joe when we were young and playing with things. Ken might be described today as metrosexual, but changing notions of what's viewed as masculine and what's viewed as feminine. We're looking across several populations here where we've got sex roles or gender roles that deviate pretty widely from what we would accept in the United States. Many societies around the world recognize more than two genders. Even in the contemporary United States, we've got individuals who self identify with labels such as transgender, intersex, and transsexual. Intersex is a biological term that refers to um, uh, conditions that involve a discrepancy between external and internal genitalia. So, for example, when you may have a mismatch between um, what's seen outside your body. So you may have what's considered to be a micropenis, but in reality, that's an enlarged clitoris, and you actually have internal female sexual anatomy. There are cases like Klinefelter syndrome, where you've got two X chromosomes and one Y. This is the most common unusual sex chromosome combination, one out of every 1,000 males. These males often have penises that are smaller than average, are a bit slower with their childhood growth, a bit slower with developing secondary sex characteristics because of smaller stature and a lack of elaborated secondary sexual characteristics. These men may often appear as effeminate males. We've got the triple X syndrome. These females have three X chromosomes, and are hyper feminized, may have extreme differentials of fat deposition, extremely large breasts without plastic surgery, etc. Seem kind of ultra feminine. We've got Turner syndrome, where girls have one X chromosome and are lacking a second sex chromosome. They're often very small in stature. They have very thin fingers, very thin bones, and are slow to develop secondary sex characteristics. We can have cases where chromosomal females, there are two instances where bursts of testosterone play a role. One of those is at 5 to 6 weeks gestation. That is when the SRY, the sex determining Y region of the Y chromosome, is responsible for the initial burst of testosterone in male fetuses that leads to the internal sexual anatomy of males. And so at 5 to 6 weeks gestation, if there's a burst of testosterone, then the Mullerian duct system of females disintegrates, the Wolffian duct systems of males grows, and you end up with the development of testes, a penis, etc., the associated um, vessels and such that move between the two. Um, there has to be a second surge of testosterone, though, at about 5 to 6 months of gestation that then masculinizes the brain. And so this is responsible for laying down the neural architecture that will basically lead to pubertal processes during adolescence. And so this results in a masculine versus a feminine brain. In the in females whose mothers might have high levels of androgen because of like an adrenal tumor or something, those females get a masculinized brain but a feminine primary sexual anatomy because of the lack of that first surge of testosterone. So these may be girls that quote unquote feel like boys and have felt like boys from from the time that they were able to talk about how they thought of themselves. We can also have chromosomal males whose external genitalia are incompletely formed or ambiguous. In cases where it's not clear whether it's a micropenis or an enlarged clitoris, historically, at least through like the 1970s, these micropenises were just removed, and these men were raised as women with big negative psychological effects. Similarly, there were cases throughout the 1970s of botched circumcisions where the circumcision went wrong, so they just decided to remove the penis and raise those boys as girls, and again with far-reaching psychological problems. There's a really interesting genetic anomaly in the Dominican Republic where there's an entire island where there is a deficiency, a metabolic deficiency, that means that the babies are born looking female, but when the testes finally start producing testosterone during puberty, all of a sudden their testes descend and they grow a penis, and they have a rite of passage where they are girls before puberty, but they are men after puberty, because of this genetic anomaly. So we can get some really interesting discrepancies between what we would call biological sex and social or cultural gender identity. Typically in the United States, though, we talk about people who are transgender. Their gender identity contradicts their biological sex at birth and the gender identity that was assigned to them in infancy. Now, many people confuse these words. They confuse gender and sex. And so they'll talk about a gender reveal at a baby shower, where really we're not revealing anything about gender, because so much about gender is determined by culture and determined after people are alive. So really all that we're revealing with ultrasounds or baby showers, or when the doctor delivers the infant or the midwife delivers the infant and proclaims it's a boy or a girl, is this external genitalia, right? Or in the case of ultrasounds, the even potentially, well, really it's external genitalia with ultrasounds as well. So gender is not something that we're revealing in utero. Um, we have increasingly had discussion about people who identify as non-binary, which means that they don't subscribe to either traditional male or female gender roles. So one thing that I'd love for you to take away from this lecture is the fact that because we are so concerned with gendering children, gendering babies, etc., we are raising the likelihood that we are misgendering people. And that the problem isn't necessarily that people identify as the opposite gender, but rather that we are imposing gender identities that are way too rigid. And in fact, I mean, there's been recognition of this with things like children's clothing. When my daughter was an infant, Old Navy released two onesies, one that said Hot to Trot and one that said Eye Candy. And these were marketed to babies as young as 3 to 6 months. Well, they were marketed to the mothers of babies as young as 3 to 6 months. We have a problem when we're sexualizing infants and saying that they are hot to trot or are eye candy. I mean, because that's objectifying them as sexual, which is really closely tied to incidents of pedophilia. So gendering kids before they go through puberty it's a detriment to everybody. Girls, by the time they enter first grade, already subscribe to the notion that they are not as good at math and science as boys. And if we're giving them that message before they even start rigid academic instruction, we are creating a problem. So the solution to that problem is not even necessarily the embracement of I mean, we need to have awareness of and embrace the rights of transgender individuals, absolutely. But what we need to do even more so is abolish the strict idea of gender. We need to give all kids toys that foster both building skills like blocks and Legos and toolkits and stuff, as well as give all children toys that foster childcare and kindness. We need to give children clothing that doesn't immediately associate with them with something girly or boy-like. My daughter loved dinosaurs, and at the time we didn't have things like Princess Awesome and Zahava that put science things and things like dinosaurs on girls' clothing. She only had fairies and unicorns and fantasy creatures like that. When for a time she dabbled in paleontology. So getting rid of a strict gender binary would help all children out, not just children whose gender identity does not match up with their biological sexual anatomy. All right. So anyway, there's my little soapbox, right? We've got a wide cultural evidence of the malleability of gender categories. We've got eunuchs who were viewed as the perfect servant. These were castrated males who would attend the harems of leaders in Byzantium. The Hijra are the third sex. They're not male or female. They are Hijra of India that indicates that there are societal requirements that necessitate the castration of some males who then fill special roles. We have two spirit individuals. Colonial entities called them Berdache, but this is a Native American concept. These are often males who adopt the social roles that are traditionally assigned to women through the performance of a third gender, contribute to the social and spiritual well being of the community as a whole. Oftentimes, among animist populations, shamans are gender ambiguous. They are non binary. They have to be able to harness both female spirits and male spirits. And so, because of that, they transcend the traditional gender binary. There are sworn virgins who are born females in the Balkan that assume male gender roles and activities when there's a shortage of men, particularly during times of warfare. Among the Gag of northern Albania, we have virginal transvestites who are biologically female but honorary men. We already talked about how among the Igbo of Nigeria, that if a father didn't have any sons, he would deem one of his daughters his son, and she would then marry a woman, and any offspring born would belong to that patriline. Um, Among the Melanesian and Polynesian islands, we've got the Fakaletis of Tonga, we've got the Fa'afine of Samoa. We've got the Mahuahin of Hawaii. These are males who behave like women and fulfill traditional female gender roles. Not so far from home, we've got the Muxe. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. It's Muxe of Oaxaca. They are born out of the Zapotec state. We've got an abundance of recognition of alternate gender identity in Mesoamerica, among the Inca, among the Maya, among the Aztec, among the Zapotec, where generally it's males who then fulfill female roles, but they are valued. In Oaxaca right now, the Muxe are celebrated in festivals, and the men who have sex with them are viewed as heterosexual, having sex with just a third gender, not having homosexual sex with men dressed as women. So gender is malleable. Gender fulfills a cultural, sometimes an economic need, sometimes just a social role need, often a religious or ritual need. And gender does not have to subscribe to this strict binary. It would be very freeing in the United States if we stopped gendering kids so young and just let kids try on identities that they wanted to try on. I never kept my kids from dressing in clothes designed for the opposite gender. My daughter dressed my son up in princess clothes until my son decided that he'd rather be an astronaut during dress up play. My 4-year old son, when he was 3, would rock the Supergirl dress that was in the dress up area of his preschool. And that doesn't mean that he's going to grow up gay or going to grow up transgendered. It just meant that Supergirl is a kick ass hero to emulate, and that kids try on all sorts of identities in play without it having any necessarily social or sexual significance. Let's stop sexualizing children. Let's stop gendering children. Let's let kids be kids and experiment before we force them into rigid social roles. All right, so lastly, we'll talk about sexual orientation. Your gender identity refers to what a person feels, acts, and is regarded as male, female, or other, some non binary. Sexual orientation refers to a person's habitual sexual attraction to, sexual activities with persons of the opposite sex, same sex, or either sex. The terms heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, and asexuality have different meanings for different individuals, for different groups, and sex norms vary from culture to culture. We in the United States think of discrete and absolute categories. You are either heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual. And there's no deviating from that. We don't see sexuality maybe as something that is malleable. We're starting to understand that love can occur across a spectrum, and that one same-sex act doesn't mean that you are obligatorily and exclusively homosexual, but that love can vary and attractiveness can vary and sexuality can vary across the life course. All human activities and preferences, including the erotic, are at least partially culturally constructed. Cultures have different attitudes about things like masturbation. Circumcision was originally innovated by the Kellogg's as a way to keep young men from masturbating by making it more painful and removing some of the pleasure of masturbation. Now, this is not talking about, of course, religious circumcision among people who practice Judaism or Islam, but rather just the social convention of male circumcision among babies in the United States. Bestiality is going to be more prevalent among pastoralists than it is among other types of adaptive strategies. So these attitudes towards different sexual norms vary both within and between societies. Within the US, we see attitudes that vary with socioeconomic status, with the region where you grow up. I mean, Midwesterners are often viewed as sexual prudes, for example. The West Coast is supposed to be more sexually liberal. Rural versus urban, and even cohort. My grandparents' attitudes towards sex, even my parents' attitudes towards sex, are way different than mine, and hopefully the attitude that I'm cultivating in my daughter. I mean, my mom told us, don't have sex till you're married. Don't have sex till you're married. Don't have sex till you're married. Whereas I'm teaching my daughter sex is a part of normal romantic relationships. Let's make sure you have all the knowledge you need to make informed sexual decisions that you're ready to deal with the consequences of. So, even in the span of one generation, attitudes towards sex have changed. The Kinsey report reported that 92% of men admit to masturbation, 54% of women do. 37% of men admit to at least one sexual experience leading to orgasm with another man, whereas 26% of women report same-sex sexual activities. Yet, the quoted proportion of the population that defines themselves as exclusively homosexual is a lot less than 37%. In other societies, like the Azande and Etoro, we find various forms of same-sex sexual activity that are normal and socially acceptable. Out of 76 societies, 63% of them have socially sanctioned homosexual behavior. That doesn't mean exclusive homosexuality. That just means same-sex relationships that are viewed as normal and part of this kind of fabric of the culture. So we'll talk about one. We'll talk about the Azande of Sudan. This reflects isolation according to sex. When boys hit about 12, they have to leave their family quarters and go share quarters with adult fighting men. From the time that they are 12 to 20, these adult warriors will pay bride wealth for and have sex with prospective warriors. While they're apprenticed, they do the domestic duties of women. Once they are 20 and they pass through to the next phase where they are warriors, they will then pay bride wealth to take their own younger male bride. At about the age of 35, when they retire from warrior status, then they marry women. So within one period of about 20, 25 years, they go from having sex with older men as male brides to having sex with younger men as warriors to having sex with women as husbands. We see similar behaviors in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. The Etoro have male-female avoidance, but regularly older men will orally inseminate younger men to help bring them through puberty and into their own warrior status. So sex norms, gender roles, sexual orientation, all of these things are constructed by cultures. All of these things are flexible. This flexibility of sexual orientation, when we look across non-human animals, we find lots of at least male-male sexual activity among chimpanzees. I mean, bonobos are notorious for female sexual activity as well. Male dogs, unneutered male dogs will mount anything. It doesn't even have to be the same species. It doesn't even have to have a hole in which to insert the penis. I mean, they mount human legs all the time, not because they're actually going to be able to make a human leg dog hybrid. So sexuality, gender identity, these are all, they don't occur in a vacuum. They are all integrated into the very fabric of our culture and therefore are able to be changed. They are able to be fluid. There will be people who don't conform with socially sanctioned or culturally sanctioned norms. Norms will change. You know, that's one thing that's happening in the US right now is that we're getting a very different attitude towards not only sexuality but also gender identity, and it's scaring people. It is particularly scaring people who have traditionally held power, and that is old white men. Old white men are notoriously slow to change. Change is going to come from the youth, from marginalized populations. And, you know, things change. They've always changed. We've always lamented the good old days. We will continue to lament the good old days. So, you know, nothing occurs in a vacuum, right? Everything is intricately linked. So, in summary, know the difference between sex and gender, why gender is a cultural construction, know the difference between gender roles, gender stereotypes, and gender stratification, be able to link the degree of gender stratification and thusly gender relations among foragers, horticulturalists, agriculturalists, and industrialists. How do the economies influence gender relations? Understand this domestic public dichotomy and how it relates to gender status. Be familiar with the patrilineal patrilocal complex and the patriarchy. Understand the relationship between the patriarchy and domestic violence. Be familiar with the increased feminization of poverty in both the US and worldwide. And understand how both sexuality and gender vary cross culturally.